In this week's edition of CivilNet's Weekly Business Digest, we take a look back at how Armenia's economy fared last year and what we can expect in the coming one. We also explore the central bank's decision this week not to raise its refinancing rate further, as well as the annual list of Armenia's top taxpayers. This week, the state-run statistical committee published its final batch of data from last year on Armenia's Economic Activity Index, a figure that closely corresponds to GDP growth. The numbers show that Armenia's Economic Activity Index grew by 14.2% last year, the highest figure recorded in 15 years. The statistical committee noted that much of the growth was driven by booms in construction, industry, services, and trade. The UN's new World Economic Situation and Prospects report for 2023 largely bears out that figure, putting Armenia's estimated real GDP growth last year at 14% even. According to the UN, that gives Armenia the highest year-on-year growth of any former Soviet country. Second place goes to neighboring Georgia, whose economy expanded by about 10.4%. Compare that to the average growth rate last year in the Commonwealth of Independent States, a grouping of former Soviet countries, which was negative 3.3%. Several CIS economies performed significantly better than foreseen, the UN said, amid an inflow of people from the Russian Federation and the relocation of Russian businesses seeking to avoid the impacts of sanctions, especially in the IT and finance sectors. Money transfers from Russia sharply increased. Armenia also outperformed many other former Soviet countries on another key metric, inflation. The UN's report estimates that Armenia's consumer price inflation rate last year was 8.8%, one of the lowest figures in the region. For comparison, inflation in Georgia hit 12.4% year-on-year, while the former Soviet average was even higher, at 14.6%. Inflation reached high, mostly double-digit levels in the region in 2022, amid escalating food and energy prices, supply chain disruptions, and a wave of migration, the UN noted, while adding that inflation is expected to decelerate in 2023. Likely reflecting that belief, Armenia's central bank decided this week to leave its refinancing rate unchanged at 10.75%. Amid rising inflation last year, the central bank hiked its refinancing rate 6 separate times, most recently in December. The refinancing rate is the interest rate that commercial banks pay to borrow money from the central bank. Central banks will often raise their refinancing rates when they believe the economy has become overheated and inflation is growing too quickly. In other news looking back at last year's economic developments, the State Revenue Committee put out its annual list of Armenia's top 1,000 taxpayers last week. The Zangezur Copper Molybdenum Combine, a major mine in southern Armenia, retained its number one spot, paying about $360 million in taxes last year, or nearly 7.5% of Armenia's total tax revenues. That is more than double what the mine paid in taxes the year before. Experts say the jump is largely due to a new export duty on copper, molybdenum, and ferromolybdenum exports levied by the Armenian government. Gazprom, the Russian state gas giant, took the number 2 spot on the list at about $133 million in taxes, while Grand Tobacco, an Armenian cigarette manufacturer, came in third at $115 million. Firms involved in mining, energy, and tobacco production dominated the top 20. Looking forward to this year, central bank head Martin Galstyan predicted a 4.6% economic growth rate at a press conference this week, name-checking construction, industry, and services as key drivers of future growth. That is, again, largely in line with figures from the UN, which is forecasting Armenia's economy to grow this year by 4% even. While far from last year's double-digit growth, that would still make Armenia a regional leader. In contrast, the UN expects former Soviet economies on average to contract by 1% this year.